So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our ICBE Aviation Skillnet webinar on business continuity and risk. Today, our presenter is Ron Mendes, arranged through the Professional Training Centre in Dublin. Ron Mendes is a consultant to management and board of directors. Ron is a fellow of the Institute of Chartered Accountants and has been the chair of the Audit and Risk Committee of the Chartered Institute of Housing. Ron is a member of the UK's Chamber of Commerce Brexit Advisory Committee and more recently its Coronavirus Support Group. And Ron also specialises in providing the requisite skills that include change management, leadership, critical decision making, influencing skills, effective negotiation, body language recognition and conflict resolution skills to management worldwide. Our ground rules for today: Ron will present for about 50 minutes before opening up the discussion for further exploration. For now, everybody is muted. We encourage you to submit questions and comments on the chat function. Where we encounter problems with broadband, please bear with us in case we need to pause the camera. Today's session is being recorded, and just now I will pass you over to Ron and we will get started.
Hello.
Yes, Ron, over to you. Thank you.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending in your lunch hour. Good of you to do so. So if we can go to the first slide. Thanks, Clodagh. Right. Sorry, the slide after that, just with my background on it. Next slide. Okay. I won't go through this line by line because Clodagh's given an introduction. I'll just pick out one or two items which may not be on the slide. I've done an international conference on risk management a few years ago now, in the last decade, and there were about 400 people from around the world, and some of them were from Russia, and the Russian delegation approached me afterwards, and I worked with some major Russian companies for the last 10, 20 years, like Gazprom, Russian National State Railways. And what may be relevant for aviation, I've done risk management with the Space Station Maintenance Company, which is because the space station is maintained by the Russians. So a little bit more on that side. Okay, otherwise, it's all on the slide. You can read it. And I look forward to coming back to seeing one of the subsidiaries I worked with of Diageo, which was Guinness. Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, the seminar is based on the principles of risk management and the practices as contained in COSO and ISO, the International Accounting Standards 31.000/2018. I do change things a bit. So I'll just go through a few points which are not on the slide. What I tend to do is use the KISS method, both in terms of seminars and actual risk management practice. And before anyone keeps saying, oh my goodness, I'm glad it's online and he's not face-to-face with us, by KISS, I mean the keep it simple approach. The first point I'd like to make is that besides the ISOs, or the second point, I also look at integrating risk management with business continuity management, BSM, and BCM, sorry, and DSM, which is disaster scenario management. The latter, the two of them are about minimizing loss or preventing, whereas risk management per se is about preventing risk occurring. Now, another key point is that in a lot of companies I've worked with, there isn't a common language of risk. Management's understanding of risk can be slightly different from those at non-managerial level. And most of my work involves ensuring that there's a common language of risk in an organization. Otherwise, it's a bit like the United Nations and everyone's speaking their own language.
Yeah, I'll have a look at them, Bob, and I'll come back to you on them.
But there are no interpreters present. Whilst communication and discourse needs to be a common one, I think when it comes to the distinction and responsibilities, there needs to be a big distinction between strategic risk management and operational risk management. One is for the senior management, the operational risk is for the rest of the organization. In terms of integration, there is another form, which is integrating risk management, business continuity planning, and disaster scenario management and planning with business planning. Now, business planning is in two parts. I'll cover that on the next seminar we do, but it's important to also integrate that with the business model of the organization, because when the business plan changes, the risk management, business continuity management, and disaster scenario management can also change. And when the business model changes, obviously risk management, business continuity management, and disaster scenario management can change. This is not always obvious, but those are 6 or 7 of the important points to bear in mind. Next slide, please. So if I can ask, how many risk managers are there in the room? We're up to 36 participants so far. Could you, I know there's one who declared, but could you
if you could do a thumbs up, maybe we can let Ron know how many people are involved in risk management in the room. Yeah. 1, 2.
Thanks, Mike. Okay, it doesn't matter. That's fine. Yep, that's good. Thank you, Josephine. Okay, we'll move on. Certainly when it comes to questions, we may find some more. Okay, next slide, please, Claudia. Just some overall comments. There are those who can avoid or mitigate adverse events. There are those who have adverse events happen to them. And then there are those who are wondering how adverse events occurred. The first line is for those who actually practice very good risk management. The second line is for those whose risk management is perhaps not quite so good. And then there are those who wonder how the adverse events happen, or for those who really don't practice risk management or have business continuity planning. Clearly from all the participants in the room, you're all major blue chip companies, world-class companies, so you're obviously all in the first category. Next slide, please. But risk management itself, there was Donald Rumsfeld, who in the first Iraq war said that there were known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. And everyone thought it was a pretty strange comment to make, but he was actually right. When you look at risk management, the known knowns are what you do every day, what happens as normal processes. The known unknowns really refer to basic risk management. You know it's happened, perhaps to other organizations. And then there are the unknown unknowns, what comes out of left field. And we try in my sessions to try and identify unknown unknowns. Now, it doesn't involve wearing a scarf around your head and a crystal ball, but there are ways to see what potential unknown unknowns can arise. Okay, next slide, please. But when you look at risk management itself, it isn't really just a science, it's also an art. But one of the biggest aspects of risk management is intuition. And that sometimes is what can save an organization. Next slide, please, Claudia. So in the context of risk management that I cover, there are 3 silos. The first silo is insurance risk management, which is not a speciality of mine, and I don't deal with it. The second, even though in my time at PricewaterhouseCoopers, I audited some of the major insurance companies based in the UK. I'm not an expert in health and safety, but then there's business risk management. And today's session and the one-day session will cover business risk management. Next slide, please, Claudia. So just putting that in a different context on a schematic. So there's insurance risk management to the left, which I'm not covering. There's health and safety risk management to the right, which I'm not covering, but certainly business risk management, which really can be divided into 21st century modern risk management, which includes maximizing gain. But the old method of risk management was simply about minimizing loss. And as I mentioned, business continuity management and disaster scenario management is about minimizing loss. But really, the mainstream risk management should focus on maximizing gain as well. Next slide, please, Claudia. Okay, there are many definitions of risk. Some are 20th century definitions, and are not holistic enough. And there are many definitions of risk management, some of which are acceptable, but few are holistic enough. And what I mean by that is if you take the most common definition of risk, it's something which creates loss for an organization. True, but there are other aspects of risk in a definition. And I'll cover that in the one-day seminar, which will follow on from this one, I believe. Certainly the same thing applies to definitions of risk management as opposed to just risk itself. And there are, again, a number of definitions of risk management, but there's a more holistic one, which I'll cover in the next session. Next slide, please, Clara. So I'm not going to go through this in any great detail because there are certainly a number of risk managers in the room. And indeed, even if you are not a risk manager, then you understand that the risk management framework, process, and practice is about identifying potential risks, prioritizing them. I think BIA, business impact analysis, is another way of looking at prioritizing potential risks, and then monitoring them between high and medium priority, the onset of high and medium priority, and the adequacy of risk response measures, and then how you respond to them, high and medium risk, and then reporting on it. And again, there are aspects on the reporting side, which I'll cover in the one-day session. What's very important is when there's unsuccessful risk containment and reasons for it, that it's used to inform future risk management in the organization or business continuity management. Next slide, please, Claudia. So just putting it schematically, going in a clockwise circle, one identifies and sets risk controls, prioritizing them, monitoring, responding, and reporting, and the cycle goes round. How frequently that cycle goes round, depending on your organization, it should be at least once a month, perhaps once a quarter, but certainly not once a year. And in days gone past, I think there were organizations which did it just once a year, but obviously not so with current experiences. So next slide, please, Clara. The approaches to risk management, there are at least 4 to 5 approaches to risk management, some which are effective and some ineffective, but it's critical for effective risk management to have the right approach. I'll only mention one of the 20th century ways of doing risk management, which was paper-based risk management. But pieces of paper don't protect an organization. We'll cover that in a bit more detail on the one-day session, but it is essential for effective risk management to have the right approach. Next slide, please, Claudia. So how do you identify risk? Again, there are at least half a dozen techniques which can be used. Some can be of very little value. I'm not identifying all of them here because I'd like you, if you're going to attend the subsequent one-day session, to see how many ways you have in your organization for identifying risk. Clearly, there are some which are not so effective. For instance, there is what keeps you awake at night? Well, it may be big risks, but it could be you're an insomniac. The other ways are to use brainstorming, which again, I wouldn't recommend. Brainstorming is fine if one is doing an ad, constructing an advert on TV, where one needs creativity. There may be a need for creativity in risks, in identifying risks, but there are certainly other techniques which can be of more use, and we'll cover that on the one-day session. Next slide, please, Claudia. So how do you prioritize risk? Now, this is a bit more standardized, and I'm sure it hasn't changed that much. The business impact analysis has not changed, and how you respond to them as well has been fairly consistent throughout. But we'll go through that again on the next session. Next slide, please, Clodagh. So this is now something which is quite important, which is analyzing the type of risks you have in your business. And there are at least 5 main risk categories that we promote. Without identifying all categories of risk, it can be similar to using a coronavirus clinical protection face mask with holes in it. Again, we'll look at all of those on the next session. So next slide, please. There are also types of controls. We identify 4 main types of risk management controls. Again, either on the types of risks or on the types of controls in the Q&A session, rather than ask me what they are. I think it's more instructive and useful for you to have a look and see what types of risks you analyze in your business and what types of controls, risk management controls you identify. And that we'll compare those to the ones we promote. But essentially, without identifying all 4 types of controls, it's similar to a clinician. And this is the only bit about COVID-19, which I'm covering. It's similar to a clinician in a specialist COVID-19 hospital, working without the right equipment, such as ventilators or PPE. But to have efficacious risk management, one has to be able and assess the risk control matrix effectiveness. It's very important. I've worked with companies where they did not have an effective risk. They had good risk management practices, except the bit about the risk control matrix. And unless you've got the appropriate control for the appropriate type of risk, then in that particular instance, the risk management can be ineffective. Next slide, please, Clodagh. So how do you record risks and how do you report on risks? This is fairly standardized, but we'll look at some methodologies in the next session. Next slide, please, Clodagh. So who's responsible for risk management in the organization? I gave an indication of this when I said there's a segregation between strategic risk management and operational risk management. But that actually, taken in its overall context, risk management is the responsibility of everyone in the organization. And who manages risk in the organization? Obviously, following on from the first question, risk management in the organization and managing a risk is everyone in varying degrees. Next slide, please. So just putting risk management training, basic risk management training in a pictorial depiction, I'm going to use the picture on the next slide, please, Clodagh. You could look at it as these 2 people being from a company who are going to take a journey into the jungle, and they're going to think about what risks they could face in the jungle, and then what action they would take. The risks are unknown, but they certainly could be affected by them. So that's a pictorial description of basic risk management. Now, let's look at the next slide, please, Clodagh, which is about advanced risk management. And if we can see the next slide, please. Next slide, please, Clodagh. Okay, this is a fairly attention gap. No, sorry. Can you go back 1, please, Clodagh? Clodagh's lost that one. Right. Okay, this one is where the risks are much more apparent, and it's a bit about advanced risk management and bordering on business continuity planning, where you know that there are imminent risks and disaster scenario management risk, where you know the risks are very evident and what you're going to do to recover from that situation. Okay, and again, we'll look at some advanced techniques of risk management rather than just the basic one, where the risks are guesstimates rather than something which is fairly imminent. And I'll give you another example of advanced risk management, a taster of it, in decision making. When we look at risk management, it's really about decision making. And as I said in one of the first slides, it's scientific and it could be intuition. This one is looking at it from the scientific perspective, where I think on the course, we've got a number of participants who work on the project management side. So if you take a project is about gaining reward, benefit, or value creation. Now, in terms of assessing and taking a decision whether to do that project or not, one needs to identify the risks involved in that project. So that's good. But one then needs to do the BIA, the risk assessments. And very often, a decision is taken just on that left-hand side, as you can see in the picture. But taking a decision just by doing a risk identification and a risk assessment may not give you the right result, because one needs to look at the controls. And this is where controls are essential and very important. And as you can see, once you know what the controls are for your risk assessment to mitigate them, then you can take a decision on it. Because otherwise you could have a situation where you've got minor risks or relatively minor risks, but the controls are weak. And therefore you might not want to do that particular project. But on the other hand, you could have a project where the risk identification and the risk assessment is that they're high risk, but you could still do it if the controls associated with that project are excellent. So I hope that gives you an idea about what kind of things one does in perhaps project risk management or in other areas where decision-making is involved. Okay, next slide, please. So that's about it. I think I've tried to give as much time for, okay, next, if you go back to next slide. No, next slide, please, Clodagh. Well, I thought I'd give you a lot of time to ask questions. So if you want to take questions now, I'm happy to take them. So we've got half the time which has been devoted to the actual seminar, and I think it's useful to pick up some questions now. So if you'd like to ask me some questions, I'm happy to try and answer them.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you for that presentation and sharing those brilliant insights.